Hi everyone and welcome back to the channel. Today's video I'm going to walk you through how I created this artwork here, sort of like a vampire hunter theme. So I'm going to guide you through the steps, break it down, and give you some tips and tricks along the way. So the first thing I did was create this sky background, which is just a lot of sky images stacked on top of each other and rotated to form this sort of circle of clouds. I just got a lot of cloud images that I stacked on top of each other, so I just found these on Google and a lot of free stock image websites, and I just placed them pretty loosely. Some of them had these weird watermarks on it and they were different colors, but I first just placed the images where I sort of wanted the circle of clouds to be, and then I just grabbed a mask and just sort of masked out the harsh edges. And then what I did is I grabbed a solid color fill layer and I just sampled from the cloud background and then just filled that up just so that we wouldn't have any sort of white empty spaces. And then for this image here, because it was quite a different color from the rest of the other clouds, I just added a curves adjustment layer and just played with the lighting and some of the colors. I won't go too in depth with the exact how to use the curves. It's more like an entire video on its own. So if you're interested in that, just leave a comment down below and let me know, and I'm happy to go through that. It's a very useful and powerful tool. I know you've probably heard a lot of people talk about curves, and if you're unsure how to use it, and if you want me to go through that, I'm happy to do that. Once I sort of matched the bluish color to the rest of the image, I just desaturated it a bit because it was a bit too overly saturated. So I just grabbed a huge saturation and just dragged that down. And then here's the last image. It's again, it's pretty much the same image. So I warped all of these images. First, what I did is I just placed it where I wanted it to be, but since I wanted it more of a round shape, go into the transform mode, right click on it and go warp, and that will allow you to sort of bend this cloud shape to however you want. Great. And then I did the same thing to the other clouds. I just added a mask and just painted away the areas that I didn't want. Next, I just copied all these cloud images that I had just done and just rotated it just to give a bit more variety. So I got the same image and flipped it and then just masked out certain bits just to add a bit more clouds to the sides. And then I also added this layer here. So because the edges, my main light source was going to be in the middle, I created a new layer, sampled this bluish color and just painted over this area with that bluish color just to sort of darken those highlights a bit, because I didn't want my main focus to be on those edges either, and that's not where my main light source was going to be. And it sort of brings the viewer's attention towards the middle of the composition as well. Next, what I did is I copied it again, everything I just did, and I shrunk it down just to add a bit more clouds in the center. Got those clouds and just transformed it and just brought it in a bit, and then used a mask to sort of paint away the edges and reveal any parts that I wanted to. And since I wanted my castle in the background to be sort of on the horizon line, I didn't want to bring too much focus away from that and my model that was going to be in the middle, so I decided just to add a bit more sky. So I just found another sky image, this one here, that I masked away, and then used a curve to sort of match it better with the background. Next, with a few solid color fill layers, I just added a bit of smoke. This was just using a smoke brush and a solid fill color. So you just go new solid color, choose what color you want to make the smoke, and then with a smoke brush, you can find them. I made this one myself, just using a cloud image, but you can find a lot on the internet. If you go to Brush Easy, or if you just get a cloud image, you can create your own cloud brushes and just mess with the brush settings like the shape dynamics, the scattering, and transfer if you have a tablet. I don't use it that often. I mainly just use my mouse. I only ever use the tablet when I want to be very delicate with my painting, whether it's like clouds or things that require low opacity or low flow, or things like hair strands. That's when I tend to use my tablet. But other than that, you can just use your mouse to create this sort of cloud brush. So a helpful tip that I thought really made it a lot more easier for me to work and just sped up my workflow was just to create a rough sketch like this. I'm no drawer or painter by any means. It's actually something that I'm absolutely terrible at. And so I sort of always avoided doing a kind of sketch because it just never really looked good. But I found that it really helped in this instance, just because I knew where I was going in terms of the framing and the composition, and it helped me with the different elements that I wanted to add, and kept me sort of on track with where I wanted to go. Because a lot of the time I find I sometimes add too much to my scene, or unsure about my composition, and I start creating something and it doesn't look quite right, and then I end up changing it, and it just takes a long time because I haven't really had my composition set. So I really recommend you do this, even if you're not good at drawing, because I'm not good at drawing either. So the next thing I added was the rocks. I wanted this kind of shape, this sort of ledge. So I found this image here. A lot of the times I have trouble trying to find the perfect ledge or rock image, but I found that just drawing it myself with a lasso tool, funnily enough, just getting the rough shape, just getting a lasso tool, just say, oh, I want my ledge to look something like this, and maybe, to extend, come a bit forward here, and then kind of go into the corner here. So once you have your shape that you can just draw with a lasso tool, you can then just import your image of any sort of rocky texture. So once you've imported your image, in this case, this was the shape that I came up with, and then I just masked it out, just to add a bit more realism, to have these sort of extending bits here, so it's not just like a solid line texture, because that will look very like you just cut it out. So it's important to have these edges here. Try to follow the rock lines as much as you can, just to bring a bit more depth to that cutout. Then, because this was an extending rock, I wanted to have the bottom of it. So I just got the same image, flipped it on its side. So this was the image that I used. Again, just a rocky texture. I warped it a little bit, made it horizontal just so it looked like it was coming underneath the rock. And then I just grabbed a mask and masked out the bits that I didn't need. So this is the original image, and I just masked out the edges to make it look like it was the underside of the rock. Then to blend this better with the cloud background, so since the sky sort of determines the color and the contrast of the whole image in general. Of course, you can always change this, but this tends to be, I tend to do the sky first, just because every object you place in your scene will be affected by the sky in terms of the atmospheric perspective and just how the light interacts with the different objects and surfaces. So since this was a bluish sky, I added a bluish tint to all my objects with the main rock here. Again, I just sampled a color, that bluish color from the background, and with a soft round brush and low opacity, I just painted over the rock with that bluish color. Set the blending mode to color. That way the only thing that the layer affects is the color of whatever you painted it to. So it's just a new layer that I clipped to the rock and then painted over it with blending mode color. So I decreased the opacity of that just to sort of match the saturation and intensity of the sky. And since I wanted the model to stand here later on, I just grabbed the clone stamp tool and covered up this crack in the rock, just so it would give a platform for the model to stand on. And for the underside of the rock, I just added a levels adjustment to darken it up, since it was being covered by the top bit of the rock, so it would be a lot darker and the light wouldn't be able to reach this area. I did the same to the other side of the rock. I added in an image of the rock and just painted the areas where I wanted it to show up, just again to give it a bit of depth and that 3D element. That's an important thing to note. Like I said before, everything in the scene will ultimately be affected by the sky. To help blend elements in, it's always good just to sample a bit of the sky, and with a low flow brush, just paint over it slightly. Even if it's at a really low opacity, it really just helps bring everything together. Now I wanted this to be a whole lot darker, just because I didn't want it to be distracting, and it was going to be mainly hidden by, because my light source was going to be in the distance, and this would be a whole lot darker. So I just added a curves adjustment layer, and as you can see, I also played with the red, green, and blue channels just to blend the image into the scene better, because originally it was a bit too green, so I lowered the green, and it was a bit too red as well, so I just lowered that to match the sky. I repeated the process with the other rock elements in the background. Just got an image that I cut out. I had this rock image here that I just placed off to the side. Again, used a new layer just to paint in a bit of that blue color, and used the curves adjustment layer to darken it up. Because it had a lot of red in that picture, I dragged the red channels down to reduce some of that red color. For the archway, this is the image that I used. It was already kind of an arch shape, but I felt it was a bit too big and it was blocking, a large portion of the composition, so I wanted to reduce it. So I just grabbed a mask and just masked out the edges to make it a whole lot smaller, and I placed it here. And with the same process that I used for the other rocks, I painted over it, used a lot of curves and adjustment layers to darken it up and to blend it with the background. And again, since my light source was going to be far away, the front side, or the side that's facing the camera, I guess, would be a whole lot darker just because the light isn't reaching that. So with the curves and levels adjustment layer, I sort of just painted the shadows on the archway and then took it away from the edges where the light would be bouncing off. And then with the blank layer, I just painted a little bit more highlights on the edge just to reflect that moon that we'll be putting in the background. As the moon would also be quite bright, it's quite a bright light source, I added these highlights on the edges as well. And the rocks are a fairly reflective surface. And with the right hand side of the archway, I wanted this to blend into the rocks a bit better. Obviously this looked a bit weird, so I just added this, I think it was the same rock image. I believe it was the same rock image or a similar one. Yeah, it was just the same archway, but I flipped it around and just used this part here and then masked it out, just so it looked like it would blend a little bit better into the ground. And then repeated the process of blending it in using curves and levels to match the lighting of the archway. Now, as you can see, when compared to my sketch, the horizon line is a lot different. See, the horizon line in this image is right about here, and for this one it's a little bit lower. It's actually quite a bit lower. This is more the top third of the composition, and this one is more on the bottom third. But that's fine. Like I said, I wasn't too worried about matching this exactly. This was just to give me a good starting point as to what elements that I wanted to introduce. But once I start playing with the actual images that I had, and I had this sky image in place, I just thought it looked a lot better, especially since my model was going to be right in the center. It would make a lot more sense for my horizon line to be more in the middle, or the lower third of the frame. So because my light source was going to be coming from here, this needed to be a whole lot darker, as it was going to be hidden by this rock area here, and obviously to also match the dark values of the archway next to it. A quick tip as well is that a lot of the times if your image doesn't look quite right, it's most likely due to the lighting or the values of your composition, because your brain can distinguish difference in light easier than it can distinguish changes in color or differences in color. This is also how compression works for images and videos, using a technique called chroma subsampling, where to reduce file sizes for videos or images, it discards some of the color information and instead keeps the light information or the brightness information of pixels to reduce the file size and not have too much of a difference in quality. So that's a technique used to reduce file sizes, because it uses that trick, I guess, that your brain can distinguish differences in brightness better than it can distinguish differences in color. So which is why if something color-wise is a bit off, your brain won't really pick it up as much, but if the values are wrong for the brightness, you're most likely to pick it up, and people will look at your artwork and just be able to tell that something's wrong. You might not always be able to tell straight away what's wrong, but your brain sort of just gives you those red flags to be like, hold on, something doesn't look quite right. And 9 out of 10 times it's your lighting. And so a good trick to do what I just did here is just to get at your brush and just sample. If two objects in your scene are right next to each other, they should have similar values, especially if they're the same texture. So just grab your brush and sample, say, from the shadows on a new layer, and then grab a sample from the shadows of the object next to it. And as you can see, this is a whole lot darker than this here, which is why it doesn't look quite right. So what I did to fix that is I just grabbed an exposure adjustment layer and brought the exposure way down, and then inverted the layer mask, and then with a soft round brush on low flow, with white on the foreground color, I just made the front a whole lot darker to match the brightness of the object that was next to it. So for our castle in the background, I got this image here. Originally the image looked like this, so I had a lot of fixing to do as the light source was coming from the opposite direction, so I had to make sure to flip it horizontally. So I flipped it horizontally to make sure that as the moon was coming from the left hand side of the castle, I needed the light on that object to match that. So once I placed the castle, I used the pen tool to trace around the castle to remove it from the background. Blended the bottom just with a soft round brush just to hide the bottom of that castle, to blend it in with the clouds. To add this highlight on the edge, I double clicked on the castle layer and I believe I added a inner shadow. This inner shadow you don't have to just use for shadows. I generally tend to use it for highlights just because there's a lot more control options than something like the inner glow or the stroke. So you just choose the color of the light source, which was in this case the moon. So I'll bring the moon in just so you can see. So this was the original moon image. I used a mask to sort of take away portion that would be behind the castle and maybe covered by a bit of the clouds. Set the blending mode of the moon to screen, which makes a huge difference. And then to add a bit of light or glow from the moon, I just got a white solid color fill with the blending mode linear dodge, and I just painted on it with a soft round brush to give that appearance of that glow of the moon. So now as there's a light source behind the castle, this is why I added that inner shadow, but I selected that white color. Set the blending mode to screen and make sure that the angle is facing towards where your light source is, just above the left of the castle. And here you can play around with the settings, the distance and the size to sort of blend it in a bit better. So once you create it, since it was a smart object, it becomes attached to this layer. But if you right click on it and click create layer, it'll turn it into its own separate layer, which you can then mask. And then again, since it was quite far away, it should have less detail and a lot less contrast. So again, I just got a blank layer, got a brush, selected some of the sky, clipped it to the layer, to the castle layer, and then just painted over it with a soft brush. And I used a levels to brighten it up as it was a bit too dark. Although the light source is right behind it, it shouldn't be that dark. So I just used the levels to brighten it up slightly. And for the left hand side of the castle, since it was right in front of the main light source, I just added a little bit of a bloom effect just by creating a blank layer, sampling a bit of the moon or just a white color, and then painting over the left hand side of the castle to give it that light bloom effect. Now finally, since it was sitting in the clouds, I just thought I'd add a little bit of clouds on top of the castle image, just to make it look like the clouds are passing in front of the castle as well, which is the same technique I used for the clouds on the bottom. I just got a solid color layer, a whitish color, and then with a cloud brush I just painted on top of the castle. Now for this little island here in the bottom, I couldn't find a good image, or I probably didn't spend that much time looking for a good image, so I found this one. And as you can see, even though you have an image like this, a lot of people will be turned away in using something like this. A lot of people will think they'll have a hard time, but it is very much doable. I created a rough outline of what I wanted my shape to look like, something like this, and then I masked that out. So I'll just add a white background to this just so you can see, and then I used this mask to just paint away the lower edges with a low flow brush, just to get rid of that harsh line at the bottom that will be covered by the clouds anyway. So as you can see now, the edges of this don't look very realistic. It looks very like a stamp, right? So it looks like you've just cut it out with a lasso tool, because you have. What I did is I put this entire layer in a group, just so I can keep this original mask, but I can add another mask to it by adding it to this group. So once you have that mask on the group, just grab a brush, a hard brush with flow on 100%, and just get rid of some of that edge. And now what you can do, since without this mask, you can't go any further than this line, I grabbed I think it was a bush brush, something like this. I think I made this one myself. You just start painting in those tree areas. So with white as the foreground, I just started painting in small areas of the trees just to bring some of that detail in, and you can combine it with other brushes as well. A lot of the times I end up using brushes for my artwork instead of images, just because it's a whole lot easier sometimes, especially with cutting out objects and placing things in scenes, rather than finding the perfect tree image or the perfect smoke image. I can just grab a brush and then just paint wherever I want to in the artwork. In the rocky bits, since you don't really want that tree texture, you can just sort of draw in bits of the rock back. Just make the edges a bit more jaggedy like rocks normally are. You can also reduce the density of the mask, so you can kind of see the area underneath and follow that rock pattern as well. So what I'm doing here is I'm pressing Alt Backspace to fill that selection with black and to reveal the image underneath. So that was before, and that's after. These trees are a lot more realistic. So once I place that in the scene, again, same technique to blend it into the scene with curves, hue and saturation to bring that saturation down slightly, sampled from the sky and painted over it with a bright color, get a little bit of that bloom from the light source, and then with an exposure adjustment layer, painted the darker areas that would be hidden from the light. To add a bit of mood and atmosphere, I added a bit of smoke. So this one, I actually just used a cloud image that I hid with a mask and then painted back with a smoke brush. To be honest, I'm not too sure why I did that. I could have just used an actual smoke brush and painted it in, but this just worked for me. So for this tree on the right hand side, I found this tree image here. Since there was a lot of contrast with the tree in the background, it was really easy to cut out. I think I just used the color range to select the background and then masked it out like that. So I placed that on the lower right and then added my color fill layers to blend it more with the sky, because it'll be affected by the sky as well. And since it was a lot closer to the viewer, it'll be a whole lot darker. So I used a curves adjustment layer to bring that contrast into it. And like I did with the castle as well, I double clicked on it and added a inner shadow with the color white on screen, changed the angle to add that highlight on the tree, and I think I just reduced the opacity a bit. Once you add it, you right click on it and go create layer to turn it into a separate layer, which is what I did here, and then use the mask to sort of paint it away from the right hand side. As the light source is coming from the left hand side, it will only really be hitting the left side of these twigs. Now rinse and repeat with the other tree that I placed here, and I added my normal curves and exposure adjustment to darken that up. Same thing with the tree up here. Again, just remove the background, added a lot of curves and color balance adjustment layers, painted in some of the sky with a new layer, added that highlight with the same inner shadow technique, and so all of these layers are just adding more colors from the sky and just painting over it just to try to blend it in as much as possible. And with this last tree here, you guessed it. So I didn't do too much with this crow. I think I just used the puppet warp just to rotate his feet a little bit so it looked like he would actually be standing on the branch. Compared to the background, it's quite purple or magenta, and so I used a curves to fix that magenta. So again, I can do a whole separate video on curves, but green is the opposite of magenta. If you pull it down, you can see it becomes more magenta, but if you push it up, it'll become more green. I then added a little red glow to his eye just by using a hue saturation and colorize, and choosing the red hue and just painting on his eye. And then I added a color fill to darken this side of his body since it would be facing away from the light. And then I added the light bloom effect as well with a soft round brush, just painted on the front of the crow to add that glow. And the blending mode of that layer was set to screen, and I lowered the opacity to make it not so harsh. Now you can't have a vampire scene without a few bats, so I found this great image here. It was a PNG file of all these different bats in different positions, so this made it really easy just to select which ones I wanted from which angle and place them all in different places in the sky just by scaling them down and having them in different sizes and areas of the scene. If you're ever trying to blend birds or bats or anything like that into the sky, it's very easy. Just place them where you want them. make sure the scale is correct. So obviously the smaller they are, the further away they'll appear, to make sure that if they're next to other objects as well, that they don't look too big or too small. And then with a solid color fill layer, so for example, with this one, since it's right in front of a light source, the sky sort of overlay doesn't need to be that strong. And because it's right in front of a light source, it'll be a bit more contrasted, which is why I brought it down to 37%. It's a slight change, just because it's still being affected by the atmosphere, but not as much as it's right in front of the light source. With this bat up the top, again, just choosing different opacity levels for that solid color fill, depending on how far away you want it to look. And for this bat here, instead of a bluish color, I just sampled from the clouds next to it, just so it looked like it was more affected by the clouds than it was the sky. So that's how I did those bats. It added a real mood and sort of that eerie vampire vibe that I was going for. I thought the left-hand side of the frame looked a bit too empty, and it was kind of weird that this was the only floating or island in the scene. So to add a bit more variety and dimension, and to, you know, show that there might be like a path that goes through here, that it's not just one floating rock and then a castle in the distance, I decided to add another floating rock here in the distance. Similar technique to what I used with this rock down here. This was the original image. I just used the lasso tool to roughly select the outside of that rock, and then using the select and mask on black background, I just increased the radius. As you can see, increasing the radius sort of helps select those tree areas, and then just increasing the contrast to get rid of that white edge. You don't have to always go through and, you know, select every tree meticulously. Obviously these areas need a bit of fixing, but you can just grab a white brush and just paint back those areas. Most of the bottom of this would be covered by the clouds anyway, but you can spend a little bit of time just to bring in those details the select and mask got rid of. Now, as you can see with this, I didn't really spend too much time getting rid of the white fringing. Another tip I can give you to really speed up your work as well, if something's going to be far away in the distance and it's going to be affected by a lot of atmosphere and you're not even going to see a lot of the details in it, I wouldn't spend too much time trying to perfectly cut something out. Once I add all the different layers, I ended up just getting a new layer, and then with the clone stamp tool, just grabbing and sampling areas of the tree next to it and painting over the edges to get rid of some of that white fringing. And then with the curves, once I brought down the brightness of the actual island and using the channels to bring that bluish color into it, it's not really that noticeable. And remember, every time you're blending something into the scene, always pay attention to where your light source is, and whatever side is facing it, have that lighter, and then whatever side's facing away from it is going to be a lot darker. I added a few more layers, a bit of glow, a little bit more blue to the shadows, again just by painting it in, by sampling the color of the background, and I even added a bit of cloud or smoke on top of it to make it look like it was sort of covered in the fog or the clouds that it was sitting in. So the final thing I did before adding in my model is I just added a bit of glow onto the edges of some of just grabbing a solid color fill and painting in the areas where I wanted the glow to be reflected from. Now for my favorite part of the image was bringing in our main character or subject here. So I had this image here from Neostock, and they were already on a neutral background, so this was really easy to extract. You can even just use the select subject feature to select your subject, which is what I did here. But you just go select and mask on a black background. You can just go in with the refine edge brush tool and just paint in those hair areas. And then for these areas, I just went in with a very thin brush, hardness at 100%, holding the Alt key to paint away these areas. And you can use the left and right arrow keys on your keyboard to rotate your brush to help you match the angle of whatever you're extracting. And holding the Alt key on your keyboard will remove things from the selection, and releasing the Alt key, you can paint things back in. So once I'd extracted the subject, I flipped it horizontally and placed it on this little ledge. First thing I did, again, using a curves to bring in that blue color from the sky, I just used an exposure adjustment layer to bring some of those highlights down that were facing away from the light source. Every adjustment layer comes with its own mask, so you just make sure to paint in the areas where you want it to be affected. Now here again, it's really important to pay attention to the position and direction of the light source, and it was coming from the right hand side, so that only the right hand edges of the model will be reflecting that light. Again, it's important to pay attention to the material of the objects as well. You don't always want to be painting the objects with the same amount of intensity of highlight, as things like metal are going to be a lot more reflective than things like clothing in general. If it's like a dark fabric, it's not going to reflect the light the same as like a sword or a gun. But since she's wearing a leather jacket, that is quite a reflective material. So with the hue and saturation layer, I set it to colorize and had it as a really light blue color. It's basically white, but since nothing is ever really truly white, it's always going to have a little bit of color in it. I select this light blue color with a really low saturation and with a soft round brush on a low flow, painted in the highlights on the edges of the model. So once I did the rim light, I added another hue and saturation, and then with a wider brush, painted a little bit softer light just to add a little bit of bloom to the edges of the subject. And for dramatic effect, I also added a bit of bloom or light glow, again just with a white solid color. On the blend mode linear dodge add, I got a soft round brush and just painted really softly on the mask to reveal some of that glow on top of her. Now for the magic here, I used a really fun technique that I learned recently from a guy called Max Asabin on YouTube. He's a phenomenal artist, and I couldn't believe I hadn't used this technique before. It's really awesome, especially when you're painting things like fire or glow. So I'll replicate that effect for you now. So the first thing I'm going to do is just add a solid black color layer, and then on top of that, just a blank layer, and then finally a gradient map on top of that. So here with your gradient map, you want to choose on the left hand side completely black, and on the right hand side completely white. Now you can add the colors of what you want your magic to look like, so whether you want it to be fire or some glow, or you can choose your colors here. Let's say, just for this example, we can choose green. So we'll make it a green glow this time. So you want to choose a darkish green color and then slowly go towards a lighter green. So you want to have the scale going from very complete blackness all the way up to white, and then you want to have your glow color in the middle. You can always go in and change this later and change the colors, so just hit OK. Now this is important, you want to put everything into a group. So select that black layer, the color fill layer, the empty layer, and the gradient map that you just created. So highlight everything and Control G to put it in a group and call it magic. And now you want to change the blending mode of that to screen, and you can see you'll be able to see your image again. Now in this empty layer that you have in the middle of these two, you're going to grab your brush tool with your flow fairly low, so hit D on your keyboard to switch it to black and white. So say your flow to about 4 or 5%. I do recommend using a tablet for this, it will make it easier, but you can use your mouse as well. You just probably get a lot better results with a tablet. You want to start painting your magic. So now what this does is if you just paint, you can see it will just create this green color. The more you paint over it, the brighter it's going to get. So if you just paint in one area, you can see it creates these little glow hotspots. So obviously you want to take your time in drawing this in, but once you have your rough shape, then what I did is I grabbed the smudge tool, and you just want to sort of smudge these areas to give your shape a bit more variety. But to make it look like it wrapped around the sword, I just added a layer mask and just removed it from the areas that I wanted to appear as it was coming behind. Something like that, so it comes behind here, and then in front, and then behind, and then front, and then behind. And if you ever want to change the color, you can just come back to your gradient map. If you don't want it to be green, you can come in and maybe change it to blue. Obviously you'll have to make sure to change the other colors as well. Yeah, so you can always come in and change those colors later if you want. But in this case, I wanted it to be red. So once I added that magic, just got a red solid color fill layer with the blending mode on linear dodge add, just to add a bit of glow to it. Same technique as I used for the moon glow, just grabbing a soft round brush and just painting on the glow area. I just added a little bit of red glow where she was standing to make it look like the ground was reflecting that glow from the magic. And since we added a new light source, the objects around it need to be affected by that light source as well. So our model needs to have some red highlights. So again, with a hue and saturation layer, I chose colorize and chose the red color that matched the glow color. And with a brush, I painted in those highlights. This was the original. I just went in and painted on the creases and folds of her jacket and the underside of her arm and a bit of her leg and her shoes as well, where that light would be hitting. So the edges that you need to paint always need to face the direction of the light source. So the tops of the shoes if it's underneath her, or underneath the glow, sorry, and the underside of her arm since the glow is now beneath this. And to make it blend a little bit better, holding Alt on my keyboard, I just separated these two sliders just to blend it in a little better with the jacket underneath. And then similarly to the glow of the moon, I added a softer highlight on top of it as well with the blending mode linear dodge add, just to have a bit more softer glow around the edges. I added a bit of that glow to the edges of the sword as well, just to make it look like the sword was glowing and some of that light was being reflected on the edges of the sword. As a final touch, I got this picture of these sparks, which I thought would work really well. Set the blending mode to screen, hid everything with a mask, and just painted in the areas that I wanted it to reveal just around the sword. And it was originally this yellow color, but I just added a hue and saturation to change the hue. Instead of that yellow, I just made it a bit more orange-red. Now, as you can see, it kind of looks like she's floating on the frog. It doesn't actually look like she's standing there. So we need to add in her shadows. So I always do this in two parts. I add a contact shadow and then her full body shadow. So for a contact shadow, it's fairly easy. All you need to do is just sample a really dark color. You can just grab black, or you can grab a sort of darkish color that's near to what she's standing on. And then with a low flow, or around maybe 10% flow, and make sure the layer is underneath the model, and just paint in that contact shadow where she's supposed to be standing. Try not to go too far underneath the shoe, otherwise it'll look like she's floating. Just have it really subtly where the contact of the shoe should be meeting the rock. Just like that. It's really subtle, but it really just grounds the object. So to add the main shadow, the technique that I normally like to use is I just duplicate the model layer and move it behind. So we have here now two model layers. I grab one of them. Since this is a smart object, I'll just rasterize this, and I will click on this button here, which will lock the transparent pixels. So it's basically the same thing as a clipping mask, except you don't have to create a new layer. You can just click it and it'll lock all the transparent pixels. And now you want to go Shift F5 to fill that with the foreground color, which is currently, which is the one I sampled earlier, the shadowy color. Or you can just go to color and choose a dark color from here as well. Click OK, and then OK again. We can now unlock the transparent pixels, and I'm going to right click and change this to a smart object. So you want to hit Control T to transform, and while holding Control on your keyboard, we want to just grab the top transform point and just bring it down so that it's facing away from the direction of the light. The light is coming from this way. This is the direction that your shadow has to move in as well. If you want to reset any transformations, just go to the layer, right click on it and click reset transform, and that'll bring it back to its original shape. So again, Control T, hold Command or Control on your keyboard, click this top transform point, and we'll drag it down so it's in the direction of that light source, or pointing away from that light source. And again, still holding Control or Command, we want to make sure that the shoe aligns. So we'll just distort it, something like that. I usually like to change the blending mode to darken or multiply. Now with shadows, the further it gets away from the subject or the contact point, two things happen. It gets more blurry and it gets more opaque as well, or the opacity reduces. So that's two things we have to do to the shadow to make it blend in better. So first thing is that I like to do is the blur. So the further it gets away from where she's standing, the blurrier it gets. So we want to go to Filter, Blur Gallery, Tilt Shift, and that'll bring up this here. So these lines, the solid lines, is where the blur starts, and these dotted lines, I don't know, how do you call that, dotted lines, jagged lines? This is where the transition of the blur will finish. So anything beyond this point will be at 15 pixels of blur, and this will be 0. The solid line will be 0, and the dashed line, that's the word I was looking for, the dashed line will be at 15. Anything beyond that will be at 15. So we want the solid line to be where she's standing. If you put your mouse near one of these points, you can rotate it. So we want to sort of match the angle of the shadow. Just move it down a bit to where she's standing. So if we drag this up like that, that looks good. So we hit OK. And the second thing, that we need to lower the opacity the further it gets away from the subject as well. So to do that, we just want to create a mask and grab the gradient tool. Make sure it's on the black to white gradient, and make sure we've selected this one here, the first one. You don't want the radial one. We want to make sure that this one is selected. We want to just drag it in the direction of the shadow, so that the further it goes away, the more invisible it becomes. Something like that. And lower the opacity as well, just to make it a bit less intense. Finally, to have everything sort of merge and blend together, I added a gradient map to some parts of the image. And this was just to add a bit of blue in the darker areas and a bit of red in the lighter areas. This was on a really low opacity of 7%. As you can see at 100, it looks like that, which was too much. I just wanted a little bit of red glow to add to the background, and only in certain parts. And then with the brush, I painted it in these areas here, just so the edges weren't going red, and it was just sort of being affected by the moon, just to give the clouds a bit of a, well, I guess a blood moon sort of look. So again, very low opacity with that one, with the blending mode on color, just so it affects the color of the images and nothing else. So the final thing I did was add a camera raw filter. So once you have everything in place, I wouldn't freak out too much about if you do the camera raw filter and then you forget to add something, or you want to change something later. You can always do that if you just make sure that when you go to apply your camera raw filter, you do it to a smart object. So once you have everything in place and you're pretty satisfied with your image, just create a new blank layer and go Control-Alt-Shift-E on your keyboard to merge everything into a stamp visible layer. Or you can do it by going Image, Apply Image, and then going OK. That'll do the same thing. Then right click on that layer and choose Convert to Smart Object. That way anything you apply, any effects, will be non-destructive, and you can always come back and change it later. Then you go to Filter, Camera Raw Filter, and here you can apply your effects. So I already did that here, so I'll show you the settings that I used. But really, I'd never have a full idea of how I want this to look. I sort of just play around with the settings. I usually like to increase the contrast and the exposure a bit, as I felt it was a little bit dark. And so I just increased the exposure and the contrast, increased the clarity a little bit to bring some contrast into the midtones. I reduced the saturation slightly, as I didn't want the color to overpower it, as I wanted this to be a moody atmosphere. I didn't want there to be too much color in it. With the curve, I brought down the shadows a little bit more and the highlights slightly as well. And then in the effects section here, I just added a bit of grain. Again, this is just to blend everything together in the final image and give it that photo quality look. You can still make changes to your image because it is a smart object, and I'll show you how to do that. A lot of the images that you'll be using, they will have different blur values and different sharpness and contrast. And to blur everything together, you have to take into account the focal length, the perspective, where it is in the scene, how far it is away from your plane of focus. So in this case, my model here is what I want it to be, the plane of focus, and everything else sort of needs to match that. So the further away it is from that plane of focus, the more blurred and less detailed it needs to get. And even things towards you as well need to have a bit of blur to add that depth and perspective to it. So if we turn our camera raw filter layer off, as you can see here, I've added Gaussian blur to all my elements, and you'll see why. If I zoom in here to the crow, you can see the tree that the crow is standing on, or the branch, is quite blurred because I think the image itself is a bit lower resolution, and this one already has a blur on top of it as well, and it kind of looks a bit off as the crow is quite sharp compared to the tree. So just adding a bit of Gaussian blur to it by going filter, blur, Gaussian blur, you can just blend it a whole lot easier into the scene by just adding a slight blur to it. It just mimics the focus of a camera, so it just creates that depth of field. So I did the same thing to all the elements in the scene. Because I have a lot of groups, for example, all these rocks here, so I just right click and convert it to Smart Object. That way I can apply an effect to this whole section, and I still have my layers. If I double click on this rocks, you can see they'll still all be here. And if I ever wanted to bring it back to layers, I can just right click and go convert to layers, and I'll bring those layers right back. But in this case, I convert it to a Smart Object to bring everything together. And if I want to add a blur to this, so if you go filter, blur, gallery, and field blur, here you can just select the points of the image where you want it to be blurred and what you want it to be in focus. So I generally start with the point where I want it to be completely in focus, which is again the position where the model is standing. So I just want to drag this to my model and reduce the blur all the way to 0, as I don't want this to be blurred at all. And then the further it gets away from my model, I want to start adding a slight blur to it, maybe 3 pixels or so. I want to add a little bit of blur, maybe 1 or 2 pixels, just slightly. Same here, about 2 or 3 pixels. Now you can see that where the model is standing, it's completely in focus, and the further it gets away, the more blurred it gets. And you can have a play around with the settings depending on where the planes of focus are on your composition, but this is an easy way to just bring that focus again towards the centerpiece of your image. Now I recommend doing that to all objects in the scene. So I did it to the castle, I did it to the crow, and the islands as well. And for the clouds, I just added a general Gaussian blur to the whole thing, around 4 pixels. And then because it's a smart object, it comes with its own mask, soft round brush with a low flow. You can just paint and remove the blur from the areas that you don't want it to be that blurred. And now that you've made changes to your image, you don't need to redo the camera raw filter. You can just create a new layer above the previous one, hit Ctrl Alt Shift E on your keyboard to make a stamp visible layer, or you can go to Image and Apply Image. And then if you right click on it and choose Convert to Smart Object, you'll be able to drag the previous camera raw filter over from the old layer over to the new one, and all your settings will just transfer over, and then you can delete the previous one. So that's how I created this image. I hope you enjoyed. I hope it was useful. If you want me to do a separate video on any specific technique, or on how to use curves, or how to cut objects from scene, please let me know. Leave a comment and feel free to subscribe if you enjoy this kind of content. I'll be posting a lot more, and you can follow me on Instagram at Artisan Photoshop. That's it for today, guys. I hope you have a good day, and I'll see you in the next one. Bye.